This video was sponsored by Arte.tv. Central and Eastern Europe are catching up. According to the IMF, Slovenia could overtake Italy's economy on a per capita basis by the 2030s, and many countries could follow soon after. And it's a flip that could reshape the politics of the European Union. Since the fall of communism, economic integration with the rest of Europe, inflows of foreign capital, and from the EU budget, as well as the hard work of Eastern and Central Europeans have paid off. With those countries richer than ever before, it has fueled one of the EU's core myths: convergence. It's the idea that the EU's newest member states could catch up with the rest of the bloc. And to a large extent, it's been true. Economies have grown relative to the EU, people are richer compared to the EU average. But convergence hasn't only been about those countries' successes. It's also been down to the rest of Europe's, particularly the South's, stagnation. And it has fueled the narrative of a coming political earthquake with the rise of New Europe as opposed to the rest of the continent. In fact, the previous Polish government was so sure about its economic success that it announced its plan to turn itself into a net contributor, actually paying more into the EU budget than it receives. So I wanted to find out if those countries could keep up their economic performance to catch up, and what they might do with their newfound influence if they manage to overtake Western and Southern Europe. It's a story of both economic potential and success, but also of changing supply chains that will reshape Europe. It's the story of convergence. Much of Central and Eastern Europe's economic success can be pinned down to its integration with the rest of the EU. Even before joining the European Union, Central and Eastern Europe became an extension of German Inc. Many Western firms outsourced their supply chains to the east of the continent, looking for a cost advantage in the form of a cheaper labor force. Investment flooded from the west, leading to a skyrocketing of industrial output and productivity across the region. EU investment over the past 2 decades into infrastructure helped finance highways across the bloc and modernized aging Soviet-era infrastructure. As the rest of Europe stagnated and Central and Eastern Europe grew rapidly, GDPs relative to the EU average grew dramatically in most countries. In Poland, and even more impressively in Romania, whose GDP increased from 40% of the EU average to 80% today. This has led many to call this the EU's greatest success story and an economic miracle. In fact, the only thing that seems to have grown faster than their economies is the amount of YouTube videos on Europe's new economic powerhouses. So yes, this rise in GDP is impressive, but for everyday people, the results have been more mixed. There have been impressive rises in wages and living standards across the countries, but many regions were left behind by this transition. I mean, take a look at this map of GDP across the EU. Most of the economic growth has been concentrated in capital regions, with much of the rest of the country still far poorer than the rest of the Union. And there are some signs that Central and Eastern Europe's economic success might be more fragile than you would think. Despite some of the best education systems as measured by PISA scores, for decades the region has experienced a brain drain to the west and north of the continent. And the Czech Republic, which was the richest of the EU's newest members, grew the slowest over the past decade. In fact, the country's own Court of Accountants pointed to the fact that the country had fallen into the middle income trap, with all opportunities of export growth to Germany having been used up. It also highlighted that the country would need to make strategic choices to keep its economy growing, and that growth model may be coming to an end. Let's take a look at their place in the European pecking order and in supply chains. It's fair to say that so far they've remained suppliers to Europe's largest economy, rather than becoming advanced economies themselves. And the exports to Germany that dominate those countries' economies, particularly the auto industry, are facing severe headwinds. High energy and commodity prices, as well as the onslaught from Chinese EV producers, are undermining the trade that allowed those countries to get richer. And with aging populations, labor-intensive manufacturing that has become the region's economic backbone is becoming increasingly tricky in countries like Poland or Romania. After all, they're dependent on keeping labor costs low through an abundance of workers. And while there are some reports of EU citizens from other countries that are moving to search for opportunity, as well as a growing number of returnees from Western Europe, I couldn't find any evidence of this happening in the statistical databases of the home country so far. So with these difficulties on the horizon, does that mean that convergence is out of reach for Central and Eastern European countries? Well, no, not necessarily, because convergence within the EU is relative. It can mean one of two things: growing faster than the rest, or the decline of everyone else while you manage to keep things together. And it seems that Central and Eastern European countries are already outcompeting Southern Europe in the places where it really matters. They fare better in terms of quality education or debt, and in the case of demographics, they're even in a better position than Germany. According to the OECD, by 2050, Germany is projected to have a dependency ratio far higher than that of countries like Romania or the Czech Republic. And there are still many ways that these countries could still grow. R&D budgets are steadily rising and are now starting to catch up with the rest of the EU in the case of the Czech Republic, Estonia, or Slovenia. And these countries are also developing tech industries of their own. Lithuania is highly specialized in laser technology, Poland has developed a high-tech weapon system that even the Americans have bought, as well as a budding space industry. Poland, for example, more than doubled its industrial robot rate between 2016 and 2022, though it still has a ways to go before it catches up with other EU countries. But they could also get an additional boost by attracting more value-added production from Western Europe. While having your main export partner decline economically is bad news, Germany's problems might be the key to move their economies up the value chain. With an energy crisis at home, many German firms are looking to cut costs by employing cheaper labor. German outflows of capital saw the country's FDI balloon to 135 billion, while FDI inflows were at just 10.5 billion, with most of it again going to other European countries like Poland or Romania. So convergence is happening, it's likely to keep going due to better fundamentals, Western Europe's relative decline and stagnation, and shifting global supply chains. But what might that mean for the politics of the European Union? Well, before we do that, a word from this video's sponsor, Arte.tv. Arte.tv is a European public content platform which is available on www.arte.tv, on their mobile app, and on Smart TV app, which is completely free. And they also have a YouTube channel which is called Arte.tv Documentary, where they upload many of their documentaries about politics and society. In fact, Arte has a great documentary about the process of EU enlargement, which is what precedes the economics of convergence, which I talk about in this video. So if you want to know more about the topic, I leave you the links in the description. But recently, they also brought out a new weekly news show on European politics, which is called Arte Europe Weekly, with great explainer videos and documentaries like Endgame Europe, which I personally found amazing. So if you're looking for more stories about Europe, but also about geopolitics and society around the world, all the links will be in the description down below. Now back to the video. Well, let's first have a look at economics, because for all of their growth, Central and Eastern European countries remain economic lightweights in the European Union. Despite doubling their share of the EU's economic pie since they joined, collectively they only accounted for 13% of the bloc's economy, a share similar to Italy's and still a ways off from Germany's or France's. And that's because while they have grown fast, the countries remain demographic minnows compared to the rest of the bloc. The Visegrad countries' combined population is smaller than that of France's, and if you spread that influence over 12 countries and unalign foreign policies and priorities, you get an explanation for the region's small weight in EU politics. But it's fair to say that this convergence has meant a more equal partnership and an ability to influence the balance of power in the EU. In fact, the EU's latest members are increasingly involved in coalition building with other European countries. They made up the bulk of the French-led Alliance for Nuclear. Eventually, there might come a point where these countries might form and lead coalitions themselves, something that Poland openly states as its ambition. So perhaps the biggest change will come not from convergence, but from the readjustment of supply chains and the move away from semi-dependency on the German economy. The European Union has historically been first and foremost an economic project, and the glue holding it together is the interwoven economies of the different countries that make it up. Now, let's get something straight. No one wants to be at the bottom of a supply chain. Revenue is lower and the jobs pay less, and Central and Eastern European countries have every right to compete for their place in the sun. But one can only imagine in a world where cross-country European supply chains are weakened or disappear. One need look no further than Hungary, which has decided to bet heavily on Russian and Chinese investment for its future prosperity. Russia is providing natural gas and building a nuclear plant in the country, while China has poured money into EV and battery factories. It's something that I covered in a previous video. As a result, the country has drifted away from the rest of the European Union and aligned itself more closely on Russian and Chinese interests. Now, granted, changing supply chains could also have some positive effects. More competition between EU countries could encourage better policy making, which is in short supply across the continent, to make their economies work better. That counts for energy and taxation policy, but also for attracting and keeping talent. If governments want to keep industries and jobs, they will actually have to be competitive. It could also mean better outcome for young workers who governments want to attract, as opposed to the pensioners who are the main beneficiaries of Europe's welfare states. But when we look at convergence, there remains one important question. What happens next? Can Central and Eastern Europe keep catching up, and what will happen when it does? In 2018, Donald Tusk warned that Poland's then right-wing government would seek to implement Polexit, once it had caught up with the rest of the EU. Some of that was likely politics to scare the overwhelmingly pro-EU population of Poland. But it's easy to be pro-EU when money is coming into your country. And so what will happen when the money stops coming or goes in another direction? Will these countries just become like any other EU member, or will they drift away in a similar fashion to the UK ahead of Brexit? Well, if the IMF is right, we'll know in the next 15 years. This was Into Europe. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and go check out this playlist by Arte.tv to watch their weekly explainers on European politics.